camera fades in, revealing the dimly lit drawing room of a grand manor. A soft wind whispers through the cracked window, carrying the scent of rain and forgotten secrets. A single candle flickers, casting eerie shadows across the room. Late one foggy night, an heir disappeared without a trace. The door was locked from the inside, the windows untouched. Yet the room was empty. What was hidden behind those walls? What truth was buried so deep that it could never be revealed? And who would go to any length to keep it that way? The camera zooms in on a mysterious photograph, half covered by dust, and then fades to black. If you're intrigued by the shadows of this mystery, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Join us as we uncover the truth behind the disappearance and explore the secrets no one dared to uncover. Stay with us. The mystery is just beginning. Chapter 1. The Fog of Confusion. The evening was unusually still, with an eerie quiet that hung over the city like a heavy blanket. London was known for its fog, but tonight it seemed as if the mist itself had conspired to smother the life from the streets. The lamps flickered faintly, their light hardly penetrating the thick shroud of fog that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was in such an atmosphere that Sherlock Holmes, ever the master of observation, sat in his drawing room at 221B Baker Street, seemingly absorbed in the pages of a book. Yet, his mind, as always, was elsewhere, gathering the subtle clues that escaped the notice of the ordinary observer. Holmes sat by the fireplace, the warm light casting shadows across his face, highlighting the sharpness of his features. His hands, long and dexterous, expertly maneuvered the pipe between his fingers. There was an almost meditative quality to his movements, as though he were pondering some deep philosophical question. But in truth, Holmes was not lost in idle thoughts. He had already noticed the faintest shift in the air, the moment when the stillness of the room became the backdrop for something new. The unmistakable sound of a carriage pulling up outside was followed by a light but insistent knock at the door. Holmes straightened in his chair, the sudden change in atmosphere not going unnoticed by Dr. Watson, who had been lounging by the fire, reading a medical journal. Watson looked up, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. "Holmes, what is it? Who is it?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with an air of expectancy. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer, as if savoring the weight of the moment before the mystery was fully revealed. He placed his pipe down on the table beside him, the faint scent of tobacco mixing with the musty scent of the fog seeping through the window. "Not just a visitor, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of intrigue. "It seems our evening has taken a turn." As if on cue, the door creaked open and a figure entered. Lord Aldridge, an older man, stepped into the room. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes bloodshot as if sleep had not visited him in days. His fine clothes, usually impeccable, appeared rumpled, as though the weight of some heavy burden had taken its toll on him. Lord Aldridge's presence filled the room, but he hesitated before speaking, his hands trembling slightly. He was a man who had seen much in his life, but now he seemed undone by something more unsettling than he could bear. Holmes motioned for him to sit, and the man did so without a word, clearly too weary to maintain any pretense of formality. "My dear Holmes," Lord Aldridge began, his voice heavy with worry, "I come to you tonight with a matter of great urgency. My nephew, Reginald Aldridge, has disappeared. No one has seen him for days, and I fear the worst." His voice faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "The police are at a loss, and I am desperate. I trust no one else to solve this but you." Holmes listened intently, his gaze unwavering. He did not immediately offer comfort, nor did he rush to fill the silence with words. Instead, he allowed the weight of the man's distress to settle, as though he were weighing the gravity of the situation against the subtle clues that hovered in the air. "And why, Lord Aldridge?" Holmes inquired softly. "Do you fear the worst? What makes you believe that this is no ordinary disappearance?" Lord Aldridge's eyes flickered briefly with hesitation, then quickly darted away, as if he feared revealing too much. It was then that Holmes noticed the subtle change in his demeanor. He had spoken too quickly, perhaps too urgently, and in that brief moment of distraction, something had slipped from the man's controlled exterior. "I fear it is not the first time someone in my family has gone missing, Mr. Holmes," Lord Aldridge said, his voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "And I fear that Reginald's disappearance is no accident. I suspect foul play, but I cannot say who or why. All I know is that Reginald is gone, and I fear the reasons go deeper than mere misfortune." A slow, knowing smile tugged at the corners of Holmes's mouth. It was a smile of quiet understanding, as if he had already begun to see the threads of the mystery weaving themselves into the larger tapestry of the case. "Tell me, Lord Aldridge," Holmes said, leaning forward slightly, "when was the last time you saw your nephew?" Lord Aldridge's eyes clouded with sorrow. "3 nights ago," he replied. "He was in his room, writing something. He seemed agitated, but nothing unusual. He went to bed that night, and when I called for him in the morning, he was gone. The door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of foul play." Holmes's brow furrowed, and he stood suddenly, pacing the room as he considered the facts. A locked door, no signs of struggle. This was no ordinary disappearance. Something had happened, something hidden beneath the surface of Lord Aldridge's account. "And the rest of the household?" Holmes asked, his tone sharper now, the excitement of the case beginning to show. "How have they reacted?" Lord Aldridge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. "The family is in turmoil, Mr. Holmes. They are distraught, but no one is more concerned than I. Reginald was to inherit everything upon his 21st birthday. His father left him an estate and secrets. Secrets I believe someone in this very house would kill to keep hidden." Holmes paused, his gaze narrowing, and a sense of suspense hung thick in the air. The fog outside seemed to deepen, its weight pressing against the windows, as if to add to the tension that was slowly building in the room. "This is no ordinary case, Watson," Holmes said, turning to his companion with a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "There is much more to this disappearance than meets the eye." The fog outside swirled with an almost foreboding sense of purpose. In the distance, the faint sound of the carriage pulling away echoed into the night. Holmes turned to Lord Aldridge, his voice calm, but filled with an undeniable sense of resolution. "We shall leave at once for the Aldridge estate," Holmes declared, his words cutting through the thickening tension. "And when we arrive, we shall uncover the truth that lies hidden beneath this fog." As Holmes and Watson prepared to leave, a chill seemed to settle in the room, and for a moment, the darkness beyond the window felt oppressive. just as mysterious and impenetrable as the case that lay ahead. Yet, Holmes was undeterred. In his mind, the puzzle pieces were already aligning, and he knew that the answers would come, no matter how thick the fog or how deep the mystery. For Sherlock Holmes, the fog was never an obstacle. It was merely a veil waiting to be lifted. And so, with the quiet anticipation of a new case before them, Holmes and Watson stepped into the night, the fog swirling around them as they began their journey into the unknown. Chapter 2. The Silent Estate. The journey to Aldridge Manor was a quiet one, with only the faint clatter of the carriage wheels breaking the stillness of the night. The thick fog clung to the countryside like a blanket, muffling every sound and leaving only the occasional flicker of lamplight from distant cottages. Holmes, with his ever-calm demeanor, sat in silence, his sharp eyes scanning the mists that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. His mind was already at work, unraveling the web of this mystery, but his thoughts were carefully hidden behind his composed exterior. Dr. Watson, sitting across from Holmes, couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the air. There was an odd weight to the silence. It wasn't just the fog that made the atmosphere oppressive. It was the very nature of their visit. There was something inherently unsettling about the Aldridge estate, and the closer they got, the more Watson could feel it. The grand estate emerged from the fog like a spectral apparition, its silhouette towering over the landscape. The manor stood on a hill, casting long, dark shadows over the rolling grounds below. Its stone walls, worn by age and the elements, seemed to hold the secrets of centuries within. The windows, dimly lit, offered no glimpse into the life within, only a cold, distant reflection of the fog-laden world outside. As the carriage came to a halt at the front entrance, the large oak doors of the estate slowly creaked open. A butler, stiff and formal, greeted them with a polite bow, his face carefully composed, though there was something in his eyes, a flicker of nervousness perhaps, that didn't go unnoticed by Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, welcome to Aldridge Manor," the butler said in a low, measured voice. "Lord Aldridge is expecting you." Holmes nodded curtly and stepped out of the carriage, his eyes scanning the manor as he moved towards the door. Watson followed, his boots making soft thuds on the gravel path. There was an unnatural stillness about the place, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Holmes's keen senses seemed to absorb everything, but he remained silent, waiting for the butler to lead them inside. The hallways of the estate were grand, adorned with rich tapestries and dimly lit by the flickering light of candelabras. There was a chill in the air, despite the warmth of the hearths scattered throughout the house. The walls, covered in dark wood paneling, seemed to close in as they moved deeper into the manor. The atmosphere was oppressive, almost suffocating, yet nothing could be more soothing to Holmes. He relished in the details, his mind already piecing together the clues he knew would soon present themselves. Lord Aldridge greeted them in the drawing room, his expression one of deep concern. He had clearly not been able to rest, the exhaustion weighing on him like a burden too heavy to carry. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming," Lord Aldridge said, his voice thick with both relief and anxiety. "I cannot tell you how much this means to me. The house feels different now. Empty. My nephew was more than an heir. He was the light in this house." Holmes studied him carefully, noting the weariness in his posture, the slight tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. There was more to this than mere worry over a missing relative. Holmes had seen this before, when something was being withheld. "I understand, Lord Aldridge," Holmes said gently, but his tone was measured, observant. "But it is not merely your nephew's disappearance that troubles you, is it?" Lord Aldridge's face darkened for a moment, and he looked away, staring into the flickering fire. The silence that followed seemed to stretch, suffocating the room as Holmes waited for the man to speak. "It is the house itself, Mr. Holmes," Lord Aldridge said finally, his voice quieter now. "There are secrets here. My family. They are bound to this place by more than just blood. Reginald knew something that could unravel everything. His disappearance is not the first time something like this has happened." Holmes's gaze sharpened. He could feel the weight of those words, the tremor of truth hidden beneath them. This was no ordinary family, no ordinary household. There was something lurking in the very foundation of the Aldridge name, something that had been carefully buried over the years. "Secrets, you say?" Holmes murmured. "And what kind of secrets might those be, Lord Aldridge?" The man hesitated again, as though debating whether to reveal more. But instead, he turned abruptly and gestured for them to follow him. "Come," Lord Aldridge said. "I will show you where Reginald was last seen." The upstairs hall was even colder, and the silence grew thicker with every step. Lord Aldridge led them to Reginald's room, opening the door slowly. The room was surprisingly untouched, as if time itself had stood still since the young man's disappearance. The bed was neatly made, the desk untouched, the fireplace cold. It was as if Reginald had simply vanished in the middle of a normal evening. Holmes moved to the window, his fingers grazing the cold glass. The window was not opened, he muttered to himself, studying the lock. There was no sign of force, no indication that anyone had entered or left through the window. He turned back to the room and began a careful inspection. The air was still, the silence almost deafening. Holmes paused beside the desk, where a half-written letter lay abandoned, its ink slightly smudged, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-thought. "Lord Aldridge," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Did your nephew have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted him gone?" Lord Aldridge hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously. "Not that I know of, Mr. Holmes. Reginald was well liked by all, though." His voice trailed off, and Holmes's sharp eyes caught the hesitation. "Though?" Holmes pressed gently. Lord Aldridge seemed to weigh his words carefully. Though there were rumors, whispers about his involvement in matters that were perhaps not entirely above board, but nothing solid, just rumors. Holmes nodded, his mind racing. "Rumors can often conceal more than they reveal, Lord Aldridge. We must dig deeper." After a long moment, Holmes stepped back from the desk, his face unreadable. The room itself seemed to hold a quiet tension, as though the walls themselves knew more than they were letting on. He turned to Watson, his expression calm, but his mind was already working through the layers of this mystery. "Watson, it seems we have stumbled upon something far more intricate than a simple disappearance," Holmes said quietly. "This house is not as silent as it seems. It is full of secrets, and it is those secrets that will guide us to the truth." As they left Reginald's room, the oppressive silence of the manor seemed to follow them, thickening in the air like the fog outside. Every creak of the floorboards echoed in the stillness, and Holmes's eyes remained sharp, his mind already gathering the threads of this complicated mystery. There was something deeply wrong with this place, something that had been hidden away for years. As the door to the room closed behind them, Holmes cast one final look at the estate, the fog swirling outside. It was only just beginning to dawn on him how twisted this case might be, how many layers of deception lay beneath the surface. Reginald Aldridge was not just missing. He had been swallowed by a much larger, much darker secret. And Holmes, with his mind ever sharp and his resolve unshaken, was about to uncover it. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. The air was thick with tension as Holmes and Watson made their way down the grand staircase of Aldridge Manor. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows along the walls, which seemed to breathe with the weight of their centuries-old history. Each step they took echoed through the corridors, the silence stretching between them like an unwelcome companion. Holmes, ever observant, walked with a quiet purpose, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. The subtle way the wood creaked beneath their feet, the faint drafts that whispered through the manor's bones, and the odd stillness that seemed to haunt the house. Watson followed closely, his mind filled with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. There was something profoundly unsettling about Aldridge Manor, something in the very air that made him feel as though they were intruding on a dark secret. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to uncover what it had hidden for so long. Lord Aldridge had led them to the door of Reginald's room, where Holmes now stood, studying the door with a furrowed brow. The door was locked from the inside, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest that anyone had entered or left. The lock was perfectly intact, the handle undisturbed. Yet Reginald was gone. Holmes placed his hand gently on the door, as if trying to read its secrets through touch alone. "The room has been undisturbed," Holmes said softly, his voice low, almost as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile air around them. No sign of struggle, no indication of violence, yet the mystery deepens. A locked door, and yet it's as if Reginald simply disappeared. Lord Aldridge stood in the doorway, his face tense with frustration. "It's been like this from the very beginning, Mr. Holmes. I don't understand it. Reginald was here one moment and then..." Holmes turned to face him, his eyes narrowing with quiet intensity. "You are certain that no one has entered or left this room, Lord Aldridge?" "Absolutely," Lord Aldridge replied, his voice shaking slightly. "The staff checked the premises thoroughly. No one came in or out. It's as though he vanished into thin air." Holmes gave a small nod, his gaze returning to the door. He stood there for a moment, lost in thought. Watson could see the wheels of his mind turning, working through the puzzle with practiced ease. There was more to this than met the eye, that much was clear. Holmes was already making the connections, even if he hadn't voiced them yet. "May we enter, Lord Aldridge?" Holmes asked, his voice steady but firm. "Of course," Lord Aldridge replied, stepping aside. Holmes turned the handle of the door slowly, careful not to disturb anything. As the door creaked open, the room revealed itself in its quiet, eerie stillness. The faint smell of old wood and dust hung in the air. The furniture was simple, neat, but unremarkable. And yet there was an odd sense of emptiness about it, as though the room itself was unwilling to hold any trace of Reginald. Holmes stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced eye. Watson followed, his boots soft against the floor. The room was surprisingly ordinary, until one took a closer look. Holmes moved to the desk, his sharp gaze flicking over the papers that lay scattered across its surface. Most were innocuous. Letters, a few personal notes, but one paper caught his attention. It was a letter, unfinished, the ink still wet. The words were hurried, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. Watson leaned in to read, but Holmes was already a step ahead. "It seems our missing heir was involved in something more than we first thought," he murmured. "This letter speaks of a secret meeting, of promises made, but it's incomplete. Whatever Reginald was about to reveal, it is hidden within this unfinished thought." Holmes carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. Watson watched him, both intrigued and unsettled by the growing sense of mystery. What could it all mean? Why had Reginald been writing this letter? And who was the intended recipient? Holmes turned his attention to the window next. It was locked from the inside, the curtains drawn tightly shut. He pressed his fingers to the glass, noting the condensation that had built up against the cold surface. There were no marks on the windowsill, no signs of anyone having climbed in or out. The room seemed untouched, save for the sense of absence that clung to it like a fog. "There are no signs of a struggle, no marks of any kind," Holmes murmured. "Reginald must have left willingly, or he was taken without a trace. But the question is, how?" He walked over to the fireplace, running his hand along the cold stone. He examined the floor, peering closely at the faint dust that covered the surface. There, hidden in the corner of the room, was a slight indentation in the rug, as though something heavy had been moved across it recently. Holmes crouched down to investigate further, his sharp eyes catching something that Watson had missed, a faint trail of dirt leading towards the door. "This is strange," Holmes said quietly. "It seems that someone did enter the room, perhaps through the door after all, but there is no sign of forced entry, no sound of footsteps. It's as though the person who left was careful not to disturb the room." Lord Aldridge, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "Do you think someone from the house, one of the staff, might have been involved?" Holmes considered the question carefully, his brow furrowing. "It's possible, but unlikely. The staff seems loyal, and any intrusion would have left a trace. No, I believe this mystery runs deeper than mere betrayal within the household." Holmes stood, his mind already shifting to other possibilities. He walked slowly around the room, his sharp eyes catching every detail. There was something off about the room, something beyond the obvious. Reginald's sudden disappearance had to be tied to more than just a hidden message or secret meeting. The manner in which he had disappeared, the fact that the door was locked from the inside, that no one had seen or heard anything, spoke to something far more insidious. Watson watched Holmes, intrigued by the calm, methodical way he approached the mystery. For Holmes, every detail mattered, the smallest hint, the faintest whisper in the darkness. There was a rhythm to his thoughts, a quiet intensity that made him the greatest detective Watson had ever known. "There's more to this," Holmes murmured, mostly to himself. "I believe Reginald Aldridge's disappearance is no accident, and the key to solving this lies not within the house, but in the secrets it has kept hidden for so long. Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Watson. "We must return to the beginning, Watson. The estate, the family's history, Reginald's past. Everything is connected." The fog outside seemed to deepen, swirling in a slow dance, as if the very elements were conspiring to obscure the truth. Yet Holmes, as always, was resolute. He would uncover the secrets buried within Aldridge Manor, no matter how thick the fog or how well the mystery was hidden. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Fog. The night outside had deepened, and the fog, thick and impenetrable, enveloped Aldridge Manor like a living thing. The swirling mists crept along the ground, curling around the stone walls and spilling into the garden, where the shadows of the trees seemed to sway and stretch under the pale light of the moon. The air was damp and cold, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and moss. But there was something else, a feeling that the fog itself was hiding something, as if the very atmosphere was trying to conceal the truth. Holmes stood by the window of the drawing room, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the scene outside. The mist had grown heavier since their arrival, and with it, a growing sense of unease. It was as if the manor was being swallowed by the fog, every corner, every secret, lost in the murk. But Holmes, ever the observer, knew that the truth was never hidden for long, no matter how thick the veil. Watson, seated by the fire, watched Holmes in silence. The crackling of the logs in the hearth was the only sound that filled the room. Yet Watson felt the tension in the air, thick and tangible. Holmes was quiet, contemplative, a man who could always see beyond the surface. Watson had grown accustomed to the way Holmes's mind worked, but tonight there was something different in the air, something deeper, more ominous. "There is something to the fog, Watson," Holmes said, his voice breaking the silence. His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness to it, a sense of anticipation. "It's no coincidence that Reginald vanished into this very mist. There is something here, something we must find." Watson looked up, his curiosity piqued. "You believe the fog has more to do with this than we think?" Holmes turned away from the window, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "Not the fog itself, Watson, but the fog holds the clues we need. Reginald Aldridge was here one moment and then gone the next. There are no signs of struggle, no footprints in the garden, no indication of where he went. It's as though the fog absorbed him." Without another word, Holmes moved toward the door, his coat swishing lightly behind him. Watson, ever the companion, followed suit, his footsteps soft on the polished floors. As they stepped into the hallway, the cold air seemed to rush in from the windows, the fog creeping through the cracks. Holmes was already heading towards the back door, his mind working through the possibilities. "You think he might have gone outside?" Watson asked, his voice low as they moved through the manor. Holmes nodded, his eyes scanning the surroundings with that familiar intensity. "I do. The letter, the secret meeting. There was something urgent in his actions, something hidden. He knew something that someone else wanted, and he was about to reveal it. But he left no trace. We must find where he went." The back door opened with a faint creak, and the cold night air rushed in, wrapping itself around them like a forgotten memory. Holmes stepped out first, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Watson followed, his breath fogging in the cold air. The garden ahead was shrouded in mist, the shapes of the trees barely visible in the low light. It was quiet, too quiet, and the silence seemed to press in on them, making the surroundings feel almost unnatural. Holmes didn't hesitate. He began to walk toward the old oak tree at the far edge of the garden, the one Reginald had mentioned in his letter to Clara. The tree stood like a silent sentinel, its gnarled branches reaching into the sky, and beneath it, the earth was dark and damp, a soft rustling of leaves breaking the stillness. Watson, though somewhat uneasy, followed closely, watching Holmes's every move. "Do you believe Reginald was here that night?" Watson asked, his voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might disrupt the quiet. "Is this where the secret meeting took place?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He crouched down near the base of the oak tree, his fingers gently brushing aside the damp leaves. There, hidden beneath the branches, were small signs that something had occurred. Broken twigs, the faintest impressions in the soil, barely visible but unmistakable. Holmes's keen eyes followed the trail, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Holmes finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Reginald was here. He was waiting for someone, but something interrupted the meeting." Watson watched as Holmes stood up, his fingers touching the ground near the base of the tree. There was something different in Holmes's manner now. An intensity, a quiet certainty that he had found a piece of the puzzle. He motioned for Watson to come closer. "Do you see this, Watson?" Holmes asked, pointing to the ground where the leaves had been disturbed. "These are not the marks of a man walking in haste. These marks were made by someone or something that was trying to avoid detection. Reginald was not alone here. He was waiting, but whoever came to meet him did not want to be seen." Watson bent down, studying the marks in the soil. "Do you think someone followed him here, Holmes?" "I do," Holmes replied, standing up and brushing his hands together. "But the question is who and why. Whoever it was, they were careful. They didn't leave much to trace." Holmes straightened, his gaze drifting upward, where the fog seemed to roll and shift with a mind of its own. It was as if the entire landscape was cloaking itself in secrecy. The fog was no longer a mere atmospheric condition. It had become a metaphor, hiding the truth, keeping them from the answers they sought. "We must return to the manor," Holmes said, his voice firm. "There is more to this garden than meets the eye. The answers lie within these grounds, and we will find them." As they turned to leave, Holmes's sharp eyes caught something in the distance, a faint glimmer just beyond the mist, as though something or someone was watching them from the shadows. Watson followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Yet, the sense of being observed lingered, the tension thick in the air. They made their way back to the manor, and as the door creaked shut behind them, the mist outside seemed to intensify. The fog had become more than a mere weather condition. It had become the very fabric of the mystery, shrouding everything in uncertainty and making the unknown feel closer, more palpable. Holmes moved back to the drawing room, his mind already shifting gears. "The fog," he murmured, "is not merely an obstacle, Watson. It is a signal. It guides us, cloaks us, and hides the truth in plain sight." Watson could only nod, sensing the growing weight of the case. The manor, the missing heir, the fog. It was all tied together in a way he couldn't quite see yet, but he knew that with Holmes at the helm, the fog would soon lift. As Holmes sat down, lost in thought, Watson stood by the window, looking out into the swirling mists. He, too, could feel it. Something was coming. The fog would soon reveal its secrets. Chapter 5. The Family Secret. The morning came quietly at Aldridge Manor, though the fog still lingered, wrapping the estate in an unyielding embrace. It had not yet lifted, and the day felt suspended in time. The distant chime of a clock echoed through the halls, marking the passing hours. But in the thick atmosphere of the manor, the sound seemed almost disconnected, as though time itself had slowed to match the slow, steady rhythm of Holmes's thoughts. Holmes, however, was far from still. He sat in the grand drawing room, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair, eyes unfocused, lost in the threads of the case. Watson, always keen to understand Holmes's method, had long since learned that the great detective was always thinking, always observing, even in the moments when he appeared to be doing nothing at all. It was in these moments, Watson realized, that the true nature of Holmes's genius began to unfold. The silence was broken by the soft step of Lord Aldridge, who entered the room with a hesitant air. His face, usually so composed, was now marked by the strain of sleepless nights. The worry in his eyes was unmistakable, though it was tempered with something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. "Mr. Holmes," Lord Aldridge began, his voice barely above a whisper. I believe it is time you know the full story of my family's past." Holmes turned his attention to him immediately, his gaze sharp, expectant. Watson glanced between them, sensing that they had reached a pivotal moment in the investigation. "I have been trying to protect my family from the truth," Lord Aldridge continued, his voice faltering. "But it seems I can no longer keep the secret. You must know what happened, Mr. Holmes. It is the key to understanding why Reginald is missing." Holmes's expression softened slightly, though his focus remained unwavering. "Lord Aldridge, we are here to uncover the truth. Whatever it may be, it will not frighten us. I assure you, the only way forward is through honesty." Lord Aldridge looked down at his hands, as though the weight of his family's history was too much to bear. He seemed to hesitate for a moment longer. Then, with a resigned sigh, he spoke. "It was my brother, Reginald's father," Lord Aldridge said, his voice thick with emotion. "He was the one who uncovered the family's dark legacy, the one thing we've kept hidden for generations. The Aldridge fortune, Mr. Holmes, was not built by honest means. It was founded on deceit, on betrayal, and on a pact with forces that should have remained in the shadows." Watson's brow furrowed in confusion, but Holmes remained still, his mind working through the implications. "What forces are you referring to, Lord Aldridge?" Holmes asked softly, his tone betraying a quiet urgency. "And what exactly did your brother discover?" Lord Aldridge swallowed hard, as though the words themselves were difficult to speak. "The Aldridge estate, the wealth we've accumulated. It was all tied to a secret, a pact made many years ago. My grandfather, Reginald's great-grandfather, made a deal with certain..." Chapter 6. The Hidden Path. The fog had thickened once again as the hours passed, draping Aldridge Manor and its surroundings in an unsettling silence. The mist clung to the old stones of the house, seeping through every crack and crevice, as though it had become one with the very walls of the estate. Outside, the garden lay hidden beneath a blanket of gray, and the air, damp and cool, carried with it a sense of anticipation. The mysteries of Aldridge Manor were not yet solved, and Holmes felt them pressing in on him, each clue an invitation to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it lay. Holmes stood at the window once more, his eyes sharp, scanning the landscape. Watson, who had spent the evening sitting by the fire, readjusted himself in his chair, sensing the familiar tension in the air. Holmes had been quiet for a while now, his mind clearly racing through the many threads of the mystery. Watson, though accustomed to Holmes's silences, could not shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something important, something that had been hidden right in front of them all along. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low but firm. "Watson, I believe we've overlooked something. We need to explore the grounds further." Watson looked up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You think there's something on the estate we've missed?" Holmes turned from the window, his face bathed in the soft glow of the fire. "Yes, the garden holds more than just an old oak tree. There's something beneath the surface, quite literally. We must uncover it." Without another word, Holmes grabbed his coat, and Watson followed his lead, both men stepping out into the cold, damp night. The fog pressed in around them as they made their way toward the back of the manor, where the garden stretched out, shrouded in mist. The path leading into the garden was winding and obscured, the stones of the walkway nearly invisible beneath the dense fog. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rustle of the leaves, whispering their secrets to anyone willing to listen. As they reached the edge of the garden, Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing. There, just beyond the line of trees, was an area that had caught his attention earlier. The ground was uneven, the grass sparse, and the earth appeared freshly disturbed, almost as if something had recently been hidden or moved. Holmes knelt down, running his fingers over the soil, feeling the subtle indentation of a path, one that had been carefully concealed. "Here, Watson," Holmes said quietly, as though he were speaking to himself. "This is what I've been searching for." Watson stepped closer, looking down at the path. It was hidden under a thin layer of overgrown grass and leaves, but there were clear signs that someone had been here recently. The soil was still loose in places, and faint footprints led into the depths of the garden, disappearing into the fog. Watson felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think Reginald came this way?" Watson asked, his voice soft in the heavy silence. Holmes stood and looked down the narrow path, his expression unreadable. "I believe so. Reginald knew something others didn't want him to uncover, and it seems this path was created to keep him, or perhaps someone else, from being seen." Holmes began to follow the path, his steps deliberate and measured, as though he were carefully reading each subtle detail. Watson followed closely behind, his senses on high alert. The mist seemed to grow thicker, obscuring everything beyond a few feet, and the air had an almost palpable tension, as though the very landscape was watching them. Every now and then, Watson could hear the distant sounds of something moving in the fog, something just out of reach, always just beyond his sight. The path curved sharply, leading them to an old stone wall, weathered by years of neglect. The wall was covered in ivy, the stones slick with moisture from the thick fog. Holmes stopped before it, his sharp gaze scanning the area. There was something odd about the wall, an irregularity in the stonework. Holmes knelt down again, running his fingers over the surface of the wall, his touch steady and methodical. "This," Holmes murmured, his voice low, "is the answer we've been looking for." Watson stepped forward, his heart quickening as he watched Holmes trace the outline of a hidden door, cleverly concealed by the overgrowth. With a practiced hand, Holmes pushed against the stone, and the wall gave way with a soft groan, revealing a narrow passage hidden beneath the surface. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, but Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, his tone calm but urgent. "We must go inside." Watson hesitated for only a moment before following Holmes into the passage. The air inside was cooler, musty with the scent of age and forgotten time. The passage was narrow, winding, and low-ceilinged, forcing them to move with care as they made their way deeper into the manor's forgotten bowels. The walls were lined with old stone, the faintest echoes of footsteps reverberating as they moved forward. The passage twisted and turned, the darkness pressing in on all sides, until they came to a small, hidden chamber at the end of the tunnel. Holmes stepped inside first, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. It was an old cellar, long unused, with dusty shelves filled with broken crates and forgotten objects. But in the far corner of the room, something caught Holmes's attention. There, on the stone floor, was a small, weathered chest, its surface worn and scratched, as though it had been dragged across the floor many times. Holmes knelt down, carefully lifting the chest's lid. Inside, he found a collection of papers, yellowed and fragile, along with several faded portraits of the Aldridge family, their faces obscured by time. But there was one image that caught Holmes's attention, an old, torn photograph of a man who appeared strikingly similar to Reginald Aldridge, standing in front of the manor. Holmes held up the photograph, studying it closely. "This is it, Watson. This is the key to understanding Reginald's disappearance." Watson stepped forward, looking over Holmes's shoulder at the photograph. "It's Reginald," Watson said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "But what does it mean?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. "This photograph is a clue, Watson. It confirms my suspicions. Reginald didn't just disappear. He uncovered something tied to his family's past, something that has been hidden away for years. And now we're closer than ever to discovering what that secret is." With the photograph in hand, Holmes closed the chest and stood, his gaze shifting back to Watson. "We must return to the manor, Watson. There is still much to uncover. But now, we know that the answers are closer than we thought." As they made their way back through the winding passage, the fog outside seemed to press against the walls of the manor, thick and impenetrable. But for Holmes, the fog was no longer an obstacle. It was simply another layer of the mystery, one that would soon be unraveled. And as they returned to the manor, the weight of the case seemed to shift, the air growing ever more charged with the promise of revelation. The hidden path had led them here, to this moment, closer to the truth, and yet closer to a far greater secret that lay beneath the surface of Aldridge Manor. Chapter 7. The Return of the Heir. The atmosphere in Aldridge Manor had shifted, as if the house itself had begun to exhale, releasing the tension that had been thick in the air ever since Holmes and Watson had arrived. The fog, once so heavy, seemed to recede slightly, allowing the moon to peek through the thick clouds, casting its pale light over the manor's grounds. The night, though still shrouded in mystery, no longer felt as oppressive. Holmes's discovery in the hidden passage, the chest, The photograph and the unsettling truth that Reginald had uncovered something long buried had shifted the course of their investigation. Holmes stood at the window once again, looking out at the manor grounds, his hands clasped behind his back. He was calm, but his mind was working furiously. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, yet there remained a sense that the answers they sought were still just out of reach. There was something more, something deeper, that had yet to be revealed. Dr. Watson, who had been sitting in a nearby armchair, watched Holmes in silence. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, though Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the manor itself was holding its breath, as though waiting for Holmes to make the final move. "You've found something, Holmes," Watson said, his voice breaking the silence. "You're closer to understanding what happened to Reginald." Holmes turned slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "Yes, Watson, I am. But we are still missing a vital piece of the puzzle. Reginald's disappearance was no accident. He stumbled upon something important, something that someone, perhaps someone in this very house, wanted to keep hidden." Holmes moved to the table where the photograph lay, studying it once more. The image of Reginald, taken years ago, now seemed more significant than ever. The man in the photograph had been standing in front of the manor, a place that was filled with secrets. But it was the haunted expression on his face, the subtle tension in his posture, that told Holmes the story of a man caught between two worlds, one of loyalty to his family and one of the dark truths he had begun to uncover. "You believe Reginald knew something that put him in danger?" Watson asked, his voice low. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Exactly. Reginald was not just an innocent heir, Watson. He was a man who had started asking the wrong questions, a man who had started to look too closely at the family's past. And in doing so, he threatened to expose a truth that someone would do anything to keep buried." As Holmes spoke, there was a sudden knock at the door, a sharp, insistent sound that shattered the quiet. Watson's heart skipped a beat as Holmes's gaze flickered to the door, a spark of recognition in his eyes. He stood, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the door, his footsteps soft on the floor. "Enter," Holmes called, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. The door opened slowly, and in stepped a figure who, until that moment, had been absent from their investigation. Reginald Aldridge himself. At first, Watson could scarcely believe his eyes. Reginald had been missing for days, presumed lost to the fog that seemed to have swallowed him whole. And yet, here he stood, alive, though visibly weary, his face gaunt, his clothes disheveled, his eyes dark with exhaustion, and something else, something deeper, that hinted at the turmoil he had been through. "Reginald!" Watson exclaimed, rising from his chair. "Where have you been? We thought you—" "I know, Dr. Watson," Reginald interrupted, his voice low and strained. "I know what you must have thought, but I had no choice. They were coming for me." Holmes, who had been standing silently by the fireplace, took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Reginald. "You've returned, then," Holmes said, his voice steady, though tinged with an undercurrent of curiosity. "You've seen something you weren't meant to see. That much is clear." Reginald nodded slowly, his eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I had to leave, Mr. Holmes. I had no choice. The people who are after me, they want something I found, something that's tied to my father's past. I couldn't stay. not knowing what they would do if they found out I knew. Holmes's eyes gleamed with understanding. And that something, Reginald, is hidden within the manor, isn't it? That photograph, the chest, everything we've discovered points to a secret that has been buried for years. But what is it? What did you uncover? Reginald hesitated, his gaze shifting uneasily. I don't know exactly, but I found my father's journals. There are references to something that was hidden within the walls of this estate, something tied to our family's wealth. But it's not just wealth, Mr. Holmes. There's a darker side to it, a legacy of corruption and deceit. I've seen the records, the names, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Holmes nodded, his expression softening slightly. You've uncovered something dangerous, Reginald, but now you've returned, and it seems you've come to the right place. Reginald's gaze met Holmes's, his expression one of both desperation and resolve. I don't know who to trust, Mr. Holmes, but I trust you. You're the only one who can help me now. Holmes regarded him for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. You've done well, Reginald. By coming here, you've given us the last piece of the puzzle. The answers lie within this manor, but they have been hidden by those who would protect their own interests at all costs. But no secret can remain buried forever. Holmes turned to Watson, his voice calm, but filled with an underlying sense of urgency. Watson, we must return to the manor's foundations. If what Reginald says is true, then everything we've uncovered, every clue, points to something far greater than we imagined. We will find the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried. Reginald, still trembling with the weight of what he had uncovered, looked at Holmes with a new-found trust. What should I do now? Holmes turned back to him, his expression calm, reassuring. You've done what needed to be done. Now, stay here and stay hidden. We will handle the rest. As Holmes and Watson turned to leave the room, the weight of their next steps heavy in the air, the fog outside seemed to roll in once more, a silent reminder of the secrets still left to uncover. Reginald's return marked a turning point, a moment when the past and present finally collided, and the truth would no longer remain veiled in the mist. Chapter 8. The Family's Betrayal. The moon hung high in the sky, its silver light faintly piercing the veil of fog that had once again settled thick over Aldridge Manor. The house, though imposing, felt smaller now, its walls closing in with the weight of the secrets it held. As Holmes and Watson stood in the drawing room, a sense of quiet urgency gripped the air. The game had shifted. Reginald's return had confirmed many of their suspicions, but it also opened a new door, one that led deeper into the labyrinth of the Aldridge family's history. A history that had been carefully obscured, hidden behind layers of lies and deceit. Holmes's mind was sharp, as always, but there was a peculiar tension in his usually composed demeanor. He knew that the moment of reckoning was near. With each passing hour, the mystery seemed to grow darker and more complex, its roots tangled within the very foundation of Aldridge Manor itself. Reginald had uncovered a dangerous truth, one that made him a target of those who had long ago buried the sins of the past. But now that he had returned, the true depth of the danger was becoming clearer. It was no longer a matter of simple disappearance. This was about family, legacy, and betrayal. Holmes, Watson began, breaking the silence that had enveloped the room. What do you think Reginald's next step should be? Should he go to the authorities? What if the people behind this are still watching him? Holmes, who had been pacing in deep thought, paused by the window, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the night. "The authorities?" Holmes repeated, his tone thoughtful, almost distant. "Reginald is not safe with the authorities, Watson. Not yet. Whoever is behind this has the power to manipulate the system, to hide their tracks. No, we must go deeper. Only by unearthing the full truth can we protect him." Holmes turned away from the window and faced Watson, his gaze intense. Reginald's family has been hiding something far worse than any of us could imagine, and I now believe that the one who has most to gain from his silence is none other than his own uncle, Lord Aldridge. Watson's brow furrowed in confusion. But why? Why would Lord Aldridge want to harm his own nephew? He's been nothing but concerned about his disappearance. Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. That, Watson, is the very question that will unravel this entire mystery. Lord Aldridge's concern for his nephew has been a carefully crafted facade, one that masks his true intentions. But I suspect that the true motive lies buried in the past, in the very secrets that Reginald has uncovered. Holmes paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Watson watched him, sensing the tension building, the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to slide into place. "We must confront Lord Aldridge," Holmes continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet resolve. "It is time to see if his face can withstand the pressure of the truth." The journey to Lord Aldridge's study was a quiet one. The corridors of Aldridge Manor seemed even darker now, the air heavy with an oppressive silence that made every step echo louder than it should. Holmes walked ahead, his steps sure, while Watson followed, a sense of unease settling in his chest. Lord Aldridge had been a figure of authority, a man who had seemed both protective and stern. But Holmes's words had left an unsettling feeling in Watson's mind, a feeling that nothing about Lord Aldridge was as it seemed. When they reached the study, Lord Aldridge was seated behind his desk, a glass of brandy in his hand. The flickering firelight cast long shadows across his face, making him appear even older, more weary than before. His eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp, and there was a quiet intensity to his gaze that made Watson's skin prickle. "You've returned," Lord Aldridge said, his voice neutral, but heavy with underlying tension. "And I see you've brought young Reginald with you." Reginald, standing quietly beside Holmes, said nothing, his face betraying a mixture of anger and fear. Lord Aldridge had never truly looked at him, not really. To his uncle, Reginald had always been a tool, a pawn in a much larger game. "Yes, Reginald has returned," Holmes replied, his voice calm, almost soothing. "And with him, the truth." Lord Aldridge's expression didn't change, but the flicker of unease in his eyes was unmistakable. He set the brandy glass down slowly, as though considering his words carefully. "I trust you've found what you were looking for, Mr. Holmes, but you must understand, some things are better left buried. The past is not something we can always control." Holmes's gaze didn't waver. "The past is precisely what has brought us here, Lord Aldridge, and it is your past, your family's past, that we must now confront. You see, Reginald uncovered something in your journals, didn't he? Something that could shatter the Aldridge name forever." Lord Aldridge's hands clenched slightly around the arms of his chair. "I've told you before, Mr. Holmes, you don't understand the full picture. There are things, people, that we cannot afford to cross. Holmes took a step forward, his voice unwavering. "You speak of things, of people, but you never say their names. And I think we both know why. The Aldridge family is bound by more than just blood, isn't it? It's bound by secrets. Secrets that, until now, have been protected by silence and deception. But Reginald's return has changed that. He's seen the truth, and he will no longer stay quiet." A long, tense silence hung in the air. Lord Aldridge's eyes flickered to Reginald, who was standing rigidly beside Holmes, his hands clenched by his sides. The weight of years of lies seemed to press down on them all. The quiet pressure of years of betrayal slowly rising to the surface. "You think you can confront me with accusations, Holmes?" Lord Aldridge finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think that exposing the truth will make everything better? I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect our legacy. You have no idea what it's like to carry that weight." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I have an idea, Lord Aldridge, and I know exactly what it's like to protect the truth, no matter the cost." Suddenly, Reginald stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "You're lying, Uncle. You've always lied. You killed my father, didn't you? And you tried to kill me, too. You wanted to keep the legacy for yourself, to protect your wealth and power. But I know the truth now. I've seen the records. I've seen everything." The room seemed to freeze as Reginald's words hung in the air. Lord Aldridge's face darkened, his eyes flashing with something dangerous, something primal. "You have no idea what you're saying, boy," Lord Aldridge growled, rising from his chair. "You've spent too much time digging into things you don't understand. You're a fool, and your father was too. He thought he could expose the family secrets and still live, still keep his place in the world. But he was wrong, and now you are too." Holmes moved swiftly, his voice sharp as he spoke. "This ends now, Lord Aldridge. Reginald is not your pawn any longer. We will make sure the truth comes to light, no matter the cost." For a moment, the room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air thick with the weight of the family's hidden sins. Lord Aldridge stood there, his fists clenched, but for once, his power seemed to falter. The carefully constructed facade he had held for so many years was crumbling before him. Reginald took a step forward, his voice steady, though filled with emotion. "You'll never silence me again, Uncle. It's over." Lord Aldridge's eyes flickered, the faintest hint of fear flashing behind them. For the first time, it seemed as though the man who had once controlled everything was no longer in control at all. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression firm. "It's time to bring the truth to light, Watson. No more shadows, no more lies." As Holmes spoke, the fog outside seemed to shift, as though the house itself was releasing its breath, its secrets finally being exhaled into the night. The truth was coming, and there was no longer any place for deception to hide. Chapter 9. The Final Revelation. The silence that followed the confrontation with Lord Aldridge was suffocating, yet filled with a certain kind of resolution. The atmosphere in Aldridge Manor had changed irreversibly. What had once been a place of hidden truths and subtle manipulations had now become a stage for the final unraveling of its dark secrets. Holmes, Watson, and Reginald stood in the drawing room, the weight of the moment heavy upon them. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the shadows cast by its light seemed more oppressive than ever. Lord Aldridge, though standing with the defiance of a man accustomed to power, now appeared smaller, somehow. The facade of authority, carefully built over years of manipulation, had begun to crack, and beneath it lay a man trembling with the fear of exposure. Reginald's words had struck deep, and now it was only a matter of time before the full scope of his uncle's treachery would be revealed. Holmes, ever the calm observer, had yet to speak. He stood still, his gaze piercing the distance, as though allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. There was no rush, no need for further words. The truth had a momentum of its own now, and Holmes knew that it would come to light in its own time. Reginald stood at his side, his face a mixture of anger, sadness, and a quiet, determined resolve. The family's dark past, which had been buried for so long, was now laid bare before him. But there was still much to uncover, and Reginald knew that they had come too far to stop now. "What happens now?" Reginald asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. He had returned to the manor to confront his past, but now, with the truth exposed, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. The man who had raised him, his uncle, the man who had been his guardian and protector, was nothing more than a shadow, a liar, and a murderer. Holmes turned toward him, his gaze unwavering. "Now, Reginald, we uncover the full extent of the betrayal. Lord Aldridge's power is built on secrets, lies, and the blood of your father. The truth must be revealed, if not for justice, then at least for the peace of your conscience." Lord Aldridge's eyes flickered with fear, though he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? Do you truly believe that the truth will set you free? The power I wield, it cannot be undone by mere words." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Power built on lies is fragile, Lord Aldridge, and the truth has a way of breaking even the strongest of facades." With a quiet nod from Holmes, Watson stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Lord Aldridge, the evidence we've gathered, your involvement in your brother's death, your manipulation of the family's wealth, the corruption that has been hidden from the world, it will all be brought to light. You no longer have the luxury of controlling the narrative." Lord Aldridge's face twisted in anger, but beneath the bravado, there was fear. The truth was closing in on him, and there was no escape. His mind raced, but he could find no way out. "I did what I had to do," Lord Aldridge said, his voice shaking. "Your father, he was weak. He was going to expose everything, ruin us all. He had to be silenced. And Reginald, you were always a threat to my plans. You were never meant to learn the truth. But you've forced my hand now. There's no turning back." The words hung in the air, a confession that sealed his fate. Reginald, who had always looked up to his uncle with a sense of reverence, now saw the man for what he truly was: a liar, a murderer, and a man consumed by greed. His heart hardened with the realization that everything he had known had been a lie. "Enough of your excuses, Aldridge," Reginald said, his voice low and controlled, though the anger was unmistakable. "You killed my father, and now you've tried to kill me, all for your own gain. But the truth is here now, and it's going to cost you everything." Lord Aldridge's eyes darted around the room, calculating, searching for a way out. But the walls were closing in. There was no escape from the truth, no corner in which he could hide. Holmes stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Reginald, you have a right to be angry, but remember, this is not just about vengeance. It's about ensuring that this corruption, this darkness, does not continue to poison the legacy of the Aldridge name. It's about bringing justice, not just for your father, but for everyone who suffered because of your uncle's lies. Reginald nodded, his anger turning into quiet resolve. He knew what had to be done. The truth had to be told, and Lord Aldridge would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Holmes turned to leave, Watson glanced back at Lord Aldridge, his gaze cold. "The police will be notified, Aldridge. It's over." Lord Aldridge's face twisted with rage, but there was no fight left in him. The walls of his world, built on lies and deceit, had crumbled, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The journey to the authorities was a quiet one. As Holmes, Watson, and Reginald made their way through the foggy night, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. The truth had been uncovered, and Lord Aldridge would face the consequences for his actions. But even as they walked away from the manor, Holmes couldn't help but feel the quiet sadness that lingered in Reginald's eyes. This was a victory, yes, but it was also a loss. A loss of innocence, of family, of everything Reginald had once believed in. The fog seemed to part as they reached the edge of the estate, the moonlight casting a pale glow over the landscape. It was as if the world itself was breathing easier now. The weight of the secrets finally lifted. But for Reginald, the journey had only just begun. The family he had once known was gone, replaced by a painful truth that would take time to come to terms with. Holmes, ever the observer, glanced at Reginald with a quiet understanding. "You've done well, Reginald. The truth is often the hardest thing to face, but you've faced it with strength." Reginald's response was a quiet nod. "I didn't have a choice. The truth was always there, hiding in the fog. I just had to be brave enough to see it." And as they walked into the night, the fog receding behind them, Holmes knew that the shadows that had loomed over Aldridge Manor had finally been banished. The truth had come to light, and in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Chapter 10. A Peaceful End. The fog that had once enveloped Aldridge Manor was now a distant memory, dissipating as the first rays of dawn gently pierced the horizon. The night had passed, bringing with it the quiet satisfaction of justice served. Holmes, Watson, and Reginald stood at the edge of the estate, the weight of their journey still heavy on their shoulders, but the air now seemed lighter, almost serene. It was as though the manor itself, after centuries of holding its secrets, had exhaled a long overdue breath of relief. The fog, which had once seemed to conceal the truth, was now absent, and the world seemed clearer in its absence. The once towering and mysterious walls of Aldridge Manor now seemed less imposing in the early morning light, their shadow no longer casting a pall over the estate. It was as though the land itself was waking up, stretching after a long, troubled sleep, ready to embrace the new day. Reginald stood by the gates of the manor, looking out over the grounds he had once known so well. His expression was no longer one of anger or confusion, but a quiet calm, the result of months, or perhaps years, of turmoil finally reaching its conclusion. Holmes, standing by his side, offered a small smile, his gaze softening as he watched the young man take in the peaceful scene before him. "You've made it, Reginald," Holmes said, his voice low and soothing, the kind of voice that only spoke when the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. "The truth has been revealed, and your uncle's dark legacy will no longer haunt you." Reginald nodded, but his eyes were distant, reflecting the deep well of emotions he had carried for so long. "I never imagined it would end like this," he said softly. "All those years of uncertainty, of wondering who I could trust. To think that it was all built on lies. I had to confront so many painful truths about my family, about my uncle, and about myself." Holmes gave a small nod of understanding. "The truth, Reginald, is often the most difficult thing to face. It has a way of shattering the foundations of everything we thought we knew. But once it is laid bare, it has the power to heal the wounds it exposes. The fog that once clouded your mind has lifted, and now you can begin anew." Reginald turned his gaze to Holmes, his expression a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I never thought I would have to face my uncle, not like this. But now that I have, I feel lighter, somehow. Even with all the pain, there's a part of me that feels free. Free from the weight of the lies, free from the shadows that followed me all these years." Holmes smiled, his sharp eyes gleaming with quiet approval. "That is the essence of truth, Reginald. It can be uncomfortable, even painful at times, but it is also liberating. And now, you are free." The journey back to London was quiet, and as they traveled in the carriage, the weight of the events that had transpired seemed to settle into a peaceful stillness. The case, which had begun with a sense of uncertainty and tension, had now reached its natural conclusion. Lord Aldridge, his treacherous actions laid bare, was now in the custody of the law, awaiting the consequences of his actions. The family's dark secrets, which had once festered in the shadows, were no longer hidden, and the Aldridge name, once tainted by lies and betrayal, was now free to begin its own journey toward redemption. As the carriage rolled through the streets of London, Watson glanced at Holmes, sensing the change in the air. The detective's usual sharpness was softened now, as though the satisfaction of the case's resolution had allowed him to finally relax. "You seem more at ease than usual, Holmes," Watson remarked, his voice quiet as he observed his friend. "I can tell that this case has weighed heavily on you." Holmes leaned back in his seat, his eyes briefly closing as he absorbed the finality of it all. "There are cases, Watson, that linger longer than others. Some, like this one, leave behind a mark that takes time to erase. But there's something different about this case. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep it is buried. And when it does, it has the power to heal, to bring peace." Watson nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How much we go through in life, the challenges we face, the people we encounter, only for everything to come down to one moment, one decision that sets everything right." Holmes opened his eyes, his gaze soft but resolute. "Yes, Watson, that moment has come for Reginald. His path is now his own, untainted by the lies of his past, and that, in itself, is a victory." By the time they reached their destination, the early morning light had given way to the soft glow of the afternoon. The city, bustling and alive, seemed to greet them with a fresh energy, as if the entire world had been given a second chance. Holmes, ever the observer, took a moment to reflect on the journey they had taken together. This case, like so many others, had been full of twists and turns, with each clue leading them down a path of uncertainty. But in the end, it had been the truth that had guided them to the resolution. As they stepped out of the carriage, Holmes paused for a moment, looking up at the sky, the soft clouds drifting lazily by. It's over, Watson. But in some ways, it's just the beginning. Reginald will move forward, and so must we." Watson smiled softly, a sense of peace settling in his chest. "Yes, Holmes, for Reginald, and for all of us. The fog has lifted, and the world seems clearer now." Holmes turned to face him, his expression calm and reassuring. "Exactly, Watson. The fog may return in other ways, in other places, but for now, at least, we can rest easy knowing that the truth has triumphed." As they walked down the street, the weight of the case finally lifting from their shoulders, Holmes felt a rare sense of peace. The case had been solved, the truth uncovered, and justice had been served. But more than that, it had given Reginald the freedom he so desperately needed. A freedom from the lies, the shadows, and the betrayals that had bound him for so long. In the end, it wasn't just about solving the mystery. It was about bringing peace, restoring balance, and allowing those who had been wronged to reclaim their lives. And as Holmes walked beside Watson, he knew that, for once, this was a case that had ended the way it should. Quietly, peacefully, and with a sense of resolution that would stay with him long after they had moved on to their next adventure.